The act of elaborating on learning material, whether the learner or the instructor is doing the elaboration, can help the learning material make more sense and stick around in memory. For that reason, it is a powerful teaching and learning tool. But what does it mean to elaborate? Think to yourself for a moment. What does the word elaborate make you think of? What does it mean to you? Typically, when we think of what it means to elaborate, we think of adding details, explaining, to describe. With regards to teaching and learning, to elaborate does mean those things, but it's not just about providing more information. The key with using elaboration as a teaching and learning tool is to help students make sense of new concepts and new material in light of what they already know. To make connections between new content, new information, and knowledge that students already have. To elaborate is to add details to what is being learned because it helps students to make connections with what they already know, and that supports understanding and durability of memory. Okay, before I elaborate further on elaboration as a teaching and learning tool, I'd like to take a helpful detour to talk about background knowledge. Specifically, the role of background knowledge in learning. Understanding the role of background knowledge in learning will help explain how it is that elaboration supports learning. By background knowledge, I am referring to that existing knowledge that a learner already has. It can be existing knowledge specifically about the subject matter being learned, or just everyday knowledge about the world and one's own life. It really isn't possible to learn something new without relating it to what is already known. We make sense of new things we encounter, we interpret them and give them meaning based on what we already know. There tends to be a misconception among instructors and students that information presented to students is somehow objective in how it should be received and understood. There also tends to be a misunderstanding among instructors that so long as the instructor says it, students have it in their heads. It's as though the information can simply be inserted into students' heads. But we know from the science of learning that how new information is received and understood by students is going to greatly depend on the knowledge they already have, the knowledge they arrive to class with. As humans, we make sense of the world by relating it to what we already know. That means the information students receive is going to be their own personal version of the information, given their experiences and prior knowledge related to the new information. But what it also means is that because students have related the new information with what they already know, the new information is more likely to stick around in memory. So it is actually a good thing to encourage students to relate what they are learning to what they already know. The reason is that existing knowledge is like glue for new learning. The more students relate new learning to what they already know, their existing frameworks of knowledge, the more durable the new learning will be. It will stick around in memory for longer, and it will be more deeply understood, which supports being able to transfer that learning to new situations and contexts. And if you are concerned about common misperceptions students tend to arrive to a class with that are just plain wrong, correcting those through elaboration can actually be great opportunities to strengthen learning, something we will talk about a little later. There are two take-home messages that I want to emphasize when it comes to the role of background knowledge in learning. One is that background knowledge is what learners use to make sense of new information. It's how they make sense of new information. It's how any of us interpret what we are presented with when learning something new. We'll see a few demonstrations of this in just a moment. The other take-home message is that making connections between new learning and background knowledge supports a more durable memory for the new material and a deeper understanding of the new material. This makes the harnessing of background knowledge a valuable tool for teaching. Next, I would like to do a couple of demos that support this first point that background knowledge is how learners make sense of new information. This passage is from a classic cognitive psychology study by Bransford and Johnson. For most individuals, when they first encounter this passage, they find it a bit difficult to understand because they don't know what it is about. I'll go ahead and read it. The procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. Now, imagine you had to remember this for a test. You might have to spend quite a bit of effort learning all the steps, right? Particularly if you aren't yet aware of what is being described. Okay, so what if I tell you that this passage is about doing laundry? Does it make a little more sense now? Let's go back through the passage. So the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. This is referring to piles of clothes, right? And how we might sort clothes based on things like whether they need cold or hot water, or if we need to separate dark colors from white clothing, and so on. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. What are the facilities being mentioned here? A washing machine and a dryer, right? And how you might need to go to a laundromat if you don't have those things in your home. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few things at once than too many. And what does that mean? Basically, if you add too many clothes or too much detergent, problems can arise, right? If you didn't initially realize that this passage was about doing laundry the first time you read it, notice how differently you understand this passage now that you have made sense of it given your background knowledge. And now, if you had to remember its content, it would likely be a much easier task because of the connections between its details and what you already know. Those connections act like glue to make the material stick in memory. Another thing this demo highlights is how learning content may be understood by an instructor who is an expert versus by a student who is new to the information. The information can seem incredibly easy and obvious to an instructor when it is not at all like that to a student. So that is something else to keep in mind, and it is why it is helpful to take a more active approach to presenting information to students. Let's turn to the second point. Making connections between new learning and background knowledge supports more durable memory and deeper understanding. We saw how this could happen with the laundry passage. Let's take a look at another example. I would like to introduce you to a cat named Poinine. Now, Poinine has an unusual name, one that would typically be quite difficult to remember. But I am going to tell you a little story about how this cat got his name, which might help you remember it. Poinine belongs to a young girl. When the girl first got her new kitty, she told her mom that she wanted to name the cat Poinine. The mom was confused by the unusual name, but went along with it. Anyway, time went by, and one day the mom was listening to the radio. The radio station was 107.9, and eventually the little jingle for the station came on and sang 107.9. It was then that the mom realized that her daughter had named the cat after the jingle. The daughter had been hearing the point .9 at the end of the jingle as poinine and decided it was a good name for a cat. Anyway, the point of that story is that by simply explaining how Poinine got his name, I got you to make connections between his name and your background knowledge, assuming that you have ever heard of those radio station jingles or have ever had the experience of mishearing things. Because of this, you are much more likely to remember his name. By explaining the cat's name, I helped you associate it with something that you already knew, some background knowledge that you likely already had. What happens is that your background knowledge acts like a sticky web for the new information to cling to. Everything we already know is organized in the brain in frameworks of knowledge. The frameworks basically consist of related knowledge that is interconnected. Bring one thing to mind, and without realizing it, you are activating in your brain related knowledge. For example, if I ask you to think of a tree, not only do you activate what you know about trees in your relevant network of knowledge, you also activate what you know about other related things, such as leaves and things that are green. And to some extent, this activation continues to spread, so that your brain is primed to rapidly apply what it knows about these activated concepts to whatever you encounter, because they may be relevant when you encounter a tree. Anyway, as learners, we use these existing frameworks of knowledge to make sense of what we are learning. For example, let's say you're learning about a tree that is new to you, the fern palm. The more deeply you can connect what you're learning with what you already know, the more connections you can make, the better you will understand it and the more persistent your memory will be. You could think of it as a tree putting down roots into the ground. The more roots a new concept puts down, roots being those connections with what we already know, the more likely the tree or concept is going to stick around and be held in place. If there is, say, only one root digging into the ground, the tree is more likely to become unearthed and tip over. So, when instructors elaborate on what they are teaching students, they are getting them to engage in elaborative encoding, and that leads to deeper understanding, which we can also think of as enriching its meaning, and it leads to stronger, more persistent memory. So, elaborative encoding could be described as enriching, adding something to, material as it is being learned. And to be clear, what you are adding are relevant details that help the learner to relate the new information to something they already know. Another way of putting it, the process of contextualizing learning material within a framework of existing knowledge to give it meaning. Basically, what this means is that learning material is placed within the context of what students already know, making sense of new learning based upon what they already know. But how do we get the term elaborative encoding? Where does the term come from? Encoding as a term generally refers to how new information is translated into a format that can be understood and stored. When it comes to learning in the brain, encoding is basically that first step in which new incoming information is transformed into a format that the brain can store in memory. Elaborative encoding is when we help that encoding process by enriching the incoming information with details that, in turn, help to relate it to existing background knowledge. See how I just elaborated on the term elaborative encoding to help you better understand it? Okay, let's go over some specific ways you can engage students in elaborative encoding when you are presenting them with information. Explain terms. I showed you an example of this when I explained how we get the term elaborative encoding. If students don't know the etiology of a term, it is more difficult to remember both the term and what it represents. Elaborating on a term gives students more to draw from when trying to remember it than just what it looks or sounds like. The more deeply new information is encoded in terms of meaning, the better it will be remembered. Analogies are another great way to do this. For example, I gave the analogy of a tree and its laying down roots in order to be more established for how elaborative encoding makes connections in the brain to make new learning more established. Draw relationships, either with other things or events out in the world that students will likely already be familiar with, like we have been talking about, or between the new information and previous course content. Let me show you an example of drawing relationships across course content. In my sensation and perception course, when we talk about vision, we talk about how certain physical characteristics of the light wave correspond to the features of light we perceive. For example, the wavelength of the light corresponds to the color we perceive the light to be. Light traveling in shorter wavelengths, like you see at the top of this figure, looks purple to our eyes. Long wavelengths appear more red. Anyway, later in the semester when we talk about hearing, we again talk about how certain physical characteristics of the sound wave correspond to the features we perceive. With sound waves, we don't talk about wavelength, but rather the frequency of the wave. The higher the frequency of the sound wave, the higher in pitch it sounds to us. The lower in frequency, the lower in pitch it sounds. But what I like to point out to students is that frequency's correspondence with pitch is a lot like wavelengths' correspondence with color. They are really just different units of measurements getting at the same characteristic of the wave. That means if our ears could detect light or our eyes could see sound waves, high-pitched noises would be purple and low-pitched noises would be red. So this is one way that I try to help students see connections across course content, which in turn reinforces certain overriding concepts that I want them to extract. So back to drawing relationships. One thing I have learned is never to assume that students will automatically see the connections between what they are learning one week and what they have learned in a previous week. So be sure to make those connections explicit to students. And one more way I'll share that we can elaborate when we present information to students is to clarify misconceptions. For one, we don't want students associating new learning with faulty background knowledge. But also, misconceptions can make it difficult for students to make sense of new information. Let me give you an example that was shared in an article I read. An elementary teacher taught a group of fourth graders a lesson on Martin Luther, the German theologian. At the end of the lesson, he gave them a quiz to see what they had learned. What he discovered is that overwhelmingly the students had confused Martin Luther with Martin Luther King Jr., the much more famous American civil rights leader. As a result, they had done very poorly on the quiz. So, the next time this teacher taught this lesson with a different group of fourth graders, he began the lesson by asking them, "How many of you know who Martin Luther King Jr. was?" All of the students raised their hands. So his next question was, "Do any of you know why his parents gave him the name of Martin Luther?" And that is how he started his lesson, by elaborating on how Martin Luther, the theologian, is someone that Martin Luther King Jr., the activist, was named after. And of course, the students did really well on the quiz. So back to clarifying misconceptions. Students likely learned more about Martin Luther because of the elaboration to clarify the misconception than if they had just heard the basic facts about him. So, in a sense, misconceptions are great opportunities to help students learn more through elaborative encoding. And to bring things to a close and to get you to reflect back on and review what we just went over with elaboration and elaborative encoding, I'd love for you to think about how you can answer this question. How might you incorporate elaborative encoding in your class? What ideas do you have? Pause the video as long as you need to do this brief reflection.